everybody. My name is Charlie McGovern, and I'm happy to be moderating this discussion with you all for the GRAMMY Museum Foundation. Very briefly, we're going to be talking about your experiences as grant awardees and how the process of receiving the grants and doing the work worked out for you, share experiences and perhaps even lessons learned along the way. And very briefly, everybody will introduce themselves, and then each of you will speak a little bit, if you don't mind, about the projects you were involved in overseeing and directing and participating in. And some sense of their significance, for so many of our viewers who are not necessarily keyed into the specializations that all of us devote our lives to. And then we'll talk a little bit more first about, again, your experiences, the process, and then some of the plans, hopefully, that you've been able to think about during this period about how you want to make these results disseminated, how do you want to disseminate these results, and you use the active verb there, into the various kinds of publics that you hope to reach. So it'll be a little bit pro forma, one at a time to get going, but then hopefully we can turn this into more of a conversation as time goes on. Okay, I'd just like everybody to, if you don't mind, to just introduce yourselves very briefly and your institution and the project you had, and then we'll talk, after that we'll go back and talk about its significance. So on my screen, Rob, you are next to me, so if you don't mind getting going, that'd be great.
Absolutely. My name is Rob Funkhauser. I am the Operations and Education Manager for the Percussive Art Society. And work primarily in our museum called the Rhythm Discovery Center. And our project was to begin work on a collection of xylophone recordings that was collected by Edwin Gearhart.
Okay, cool. One follow-up, if you don't mind. Tell us very briefly about the Percussive Art Society. Again, yeah. That could mean any number of things to people. So yeah.
Totally. So the Percussive Art Society is a professional service organization that's geared towards percussionists of pretty much all stripes. So we primarily serve students and academic instructors, but we also run the world's largest drum convention. We have a membership of over 5,000 percussionists and interact with performers from all over the world. And then where I work is the museum called the Rhythm Discovery Center, and that's sort of both the community outreach side of the organization as well as the preservation side. And we've been collecting objects. Well, we got our first donation about 1981. We've had a brick and mortar museum of some sort since the mid-90s, and we moved to Indianapolis in 2009. And so right now, the museum itself is in a period of focusing on upgrading the sort of level of care for the collections. And that ranges from the recordings we'll be talking about to instruments, to manuscripts, and anything related to it.
Yeah. Now, as a former recovering, if you will, museum curator, the care and maintenance and preservation of collections is endlessly time-consuming and calls upon all of our resources to make sure that things actually get cared for in a manner that will keep them stable and accessible over the long haul. We are battling time and gravity, among other things, and that's not always very easy. But it does engage our best. It does engage our best efforts, for sure.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Rob. Jane, would you jump in next, please?
Thank you. My name is Jane Gottlieb, and I'm the Vice President for Library and Information Resources at the Juilliard School. Our project, gratefully funded by the GRAMMY Museum Foundation, is titled Digitizing Juilliard's History. And we preserved 483 reel tape recordings from the first decade of Juilliard, that Juilliard began to record performances, and that was 1951 to 1959. The tapes represent an extraordinary range of artists and composers. They were done under the presidency of the composer William Schumann, who actively commissioned a lot of new works. One of the highlights is the premiere performance of Aaron Copland's Piano Fantasy, performed by William Missellos, which was recorded for Juilliard's commissioned for Juilliard's 50th anniversary. Other artists preserved through our project include Leontine Price, Van Cliburn, who were students at Juilliard during those years, Shirley Verrett, many others. So we have a dedicated website for the project. And a little later, if you wish, I can even share that screen with you. But that's the general overview of our project. Juilliard was founded in 1905 as the Institute of Musical Art. In 1951, it added a dance division to its existing music programs. In 1969, it added a drama division, which also coincided with its move to Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts, our present home. We also now have a jazz division and a historical performance program.
Great, thank you very much. That was, as I might expect from somebody who's involved in library and information work, very comprehensive, very synoptic, beautifully summarized. Thank you. Caroline, if you wouldn't mind going up next, that'd be great. Thank you.
Sure. My name is Caroline Jean Fernald. I'm the Executive Director of the Phoebe A. Hearst Museum of Anthropology at the University of California at Berkeley. The Phoebe Hearst Museum has been around since 1901, and we started doing field recordings, anthropological field recordings from our very early days. So through the GRAMMY Museum Grant, we digitized about 150 hours of field recordings. Some of these were, I guess, the best technology in the 1950s to preserve the original recordings from the wax cylinders. And some of these were field recordings from about 1940 to 1980, the majority from the 1950s. What was on these tapes, or these reel-to-reels, was a lot of recordings of Native American languages, Native American songs and performances, dances. So this was really a great help for the Hearst Museum to have these recordings digitized in a way that makes them a lot more accessible, because anything that makes the archives that we house at the Hearst Museum more accessible to the communities that need them the most, I think is it's a great support for the museum, and really helpful to Native California communities in preserving languages especially.
Sure. So if you wouldn't mind, Caroline, how do these anthropological recordings fit into the overall sort of collecting history / mission of the museum? Because clearly, you know, the history of Native Americans in California is a vast subject, and Berkeley, of course, has been at the center of so much of that work over the last 150 years. The scholars that came to be associated with Berkeley. But I'm just curious how this fits into what you do as a museum overall.
So as a museum overall, we are a collecting museum. We've been collecting since 1901, and we continue to collect field recordings. That was something that we haven't really been doing for decades. So that was something that we did a lot in the first half of the 20th century, and didn't do extensively beyond 1980. We do have some recent acquisitions of some field recordings from the 1980s and 1990s. This adds to, I guess, just the different branches of anthropology. So being an early anthropology museum, we were part of that anthropological museum history. So one branch of anthropology would be linguistics. And so that's how linguistics was studied early on in the development of the field of anthropology, was by doing field recordings of indigenous languages. throughout the world, but we have, I'm almost certain, the largest collection of native California language recordings and music.
Great, great. Thank you. That's very helpful. Okay, Elizabeth, you have been patient, but if you don't mind jumping in here and introducing yourself and talking about the project you were involved with. I mean, Rob introduced us a little bit to it, but I think there's a lot more you can help fill us in on.
Yeah, I'm Elizabeth Quay. I'm also at the Percussive Arts Society. I'm the museum manager and registrar of the Rhythm Discovery Center. And just to kind of expand on the project that was funded by the GRAMMY Museum, ours was a preliminary assessment of about 1,578 records, early 78s, primarily concerning percussionists of the day, a lot of xylophone and bells and marimba pieces that we hadn't had an inventory for. We'd had for about 20 years. And this allowed us to actually complete an inventory, and really now we have a sense of how many of these 78s haven't been digitized ever, and how many other ones we have that are also a really good fit for digitization based on other requirements.
So tell us just a little bit about your this collection. This was assembled by a specific musician collector, but you know what I remember, of course, from the grant and from your report is that it really covered a wide range of while you know percussion is central to all of it, a wide range of musical styles and origins. You know, it's such an interesting prism for focusing a wide range of musical expression.
Yeah, so the collection included wax cylinders, 78s, some later recordings, as well as a few instruments and a large amount of books, almost entirely based on keyboard percussion instruments, and very also focused on the early part of percussion history. Rob, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, so one of the things about percussion instruments, especially as far as the early history of industrialized recording goes, is that they translated very well. So xylophones and orchestra bells and things were used in a lot of the early records, and there was a whole culture around you know, quote unquote novelty instruments that included the marimba and the xylophone and a lot of ragtime music. But these recordings cover not only music from places like Guatemala and other traditional repertoires, but in the early 20th century, there was a whole specialized practice that doesn't quite translate to today. So if you were to talk to a percussionist today, especially like a you know, Western classical percussionist, we're sort of trained to be jack of all trades and do all these things. But back in the 20s and prior, xylophone was very much a specialized practice. There's a whole performance practice that's documented in these early recordings that people are still studying today, simply because there's always some renewed interest in it. And then as far as this particular collection of recordings goes, it's the second largest by volume that specializes in early xylophone and percussion recordings. And one thing that we had as far as our positioning as an organization is I also had access to the inventory from the other major collection that specializes in the same thing. And that assisted in the latter part to actually not only dig into what is generally known, but then also to do some further cross-referencing and research against the other specialized collection, which is also not public facing, but luckily we were given an inventory of that collection.
Sure, but that allows both of you working in concert to prioritize decision-making, I assume, and things like that.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. Elizabeth, just one sort of geeky question, but again, useful perhaps, I think, for our viewers who might not understand the process. Do you, in handling this collection, and this is, I mean, I think this would be true as well for Caroline, and perhaps for Jane as well, do you treat every individual recording as a separate object, that is to say a separate accession number, a separate record, so that you're literally tracking within the scope of one collection, many hundreds of objects?
Yeah, we have everything. Each individual 78 is considered its own object. There were a fair amount of duplicates of the same recording throughout the collection, and one of the future goals is to actually go through and devote some time to looking up take numbers and determining if there's any common recordings, but maybe we have an unusual take that would also increase its use in being digitized.
Sure. I can imagine too, just to finish this, I can imagine too that the keyboard percussion instruments, both being linked to the music of different countries and indigenous and mestizo populations on the one side, and then, if you will, the industrialized American pop on the other, US pop music. It's an interesting intersection or encounter between very different uses of the same instruments or repertoire of the same instruments in one place. So again, I could just see, I'm just imagining multiple audiences, multiple interests and users for your collection.
Definitely.
Yeah. Okay, thank you all. So let's talk a little bit. You're also so eloquent about the significance of your collections that I don't think at this moment we need to re-emphasize that. I'm sure it'll come up again as we speak more. But let's talk a little bit about the process you went through in both first identifying the materials that were in need of attention, and some of that presumably was easy, the stuff that is deteriorating or has historical significance broadly defined are the things that most people write about, but also then the process of the work that actually had to be done. Where were your challenges? Where were your pleasant surprises, if you had any? What were the kinds of day-to-day-ish that you all encountered? And at this point, I'm just going to say, whoever wants to talk, because I spend enough time in the classroom calling on people, and you guys don't need that.
I'll start if you wish.
Yeah.
We knew about the legacy of Juilliard audio recordings, and they're housed in our recording department, which is separate from the library. We knew that they had sort of a card file of information, but we didn't know the status of the exact metadata on these performances. And what we found in the process of gaining access to more information was that the early recording engineers kept very meticulous logbooks of each performance. We, of course, had the printed programs in our archives, but one of our first steps was to digitize the logbooks, which Eric Mortensen, our digital media librarian, who was the primary point person on the grant project, went through and actually created a spreadsheet of all of this metadata to match up with the particular recordings on the real tapes. One thing,
Jane, could you explain metadata for the library impaired?
Sure, sure. That means the data about the data, or the exact information, the composer, the title of the work, the performing ensemble, sometimes the duration, where the event took place. All of that metadata, as well as the speed of the recording, was all captured for our cataloging purposes. I should mention something else that I neglected to say earlier, which is that in addition to audio tapes, our earliest performance footage on 16mm film also happened during the 50s. Martha Hill was the founder of our dance division. And in its early years, she made sure to have all of the division's productions filmed so they could be documented. And those early dance performances have also been digitized, not under the auspices of this grant, but with separate private funding. But they're part of the legacies of Juilliard 1950s performances.
Yeah, I know I'm supposed to just hit the space bar, but I keep forgetting. Thank you. That was really evocative. And again, I can imagine that with either performances out of a given artist's repertoire that might not have really lasted throughout an artist's career, or some dance work that might have morphed considerably. The actual record of these moments in time can be really, really useful for folks who are trying to think through any number of circumstances. I mean, that's, again, I'm just, trying to open up, keep reminding all of us of the bridges between the individual work we do and the very broad interest in the humanities and in the arts, that, these three projects that might seem, like three different, a squirrel, a toaster, and an asteroid or something like that, actually have a lot in common, besides just the fact that preservation is what brings us all into the room here. So anybody else want to talk about challenges, process? Yeah, Caroline, go ahead.
Sure. So the Hearst Museum, what I love about this museum is that we don't get rid of anything as far as like recording equipment and recordings. We have, right, I can see in your background. So as far as the recording equipment that we have the whole gamut of the recording equipment that we use to make the recordings, which I find very interesting that we have actually saved the probably inoperable recording equipment down to this. I'm not going to use the right term because I'm not a historian of music recording, but it looks like a big horn that you would use like an ear trumpet. So we even have that, but we have wax cylinders, we have the reel-to-reel tapes, we have everything in between. So what was surprising about this process, or I think what a challenge that emerged, was that when we recorded, when these things were originally recorded, some of the languages, some of the songs that were being recorded were endangered or believed to be endangered. Many of the very few remaining native speakers of some of these languages. And now that these recordings have been digitized and are available, the challenge that we have now is that some of that information for these communities that are still around, still thriving, is not acceptable to be openly shared beyond certain people beyond that community, or even within everyone within that community. And so our challenge right now is working with these individual Native American communities, mostly throughout California, and figuring out a way to make these recordings accessible to them while making sure that we are being respectful of what we don't share.
This is, again, and I'm not an anthropologist by training, but certainly in the course of my day-to-day work, I read their work as a former museum person. Some of these questions, came to us as well. This is one of the central challenges for long-lived museums, the broad question of changing ideas about what responsibility, not just as stewards of a collection, but responsibilities to the communities who might have, were the origins of this material, but, under terms that were not fully understood perhaps, or certainly not fully accepted. And so questions of sharing and access, repatriation, care, it's no shame to say that, Berkeley as a major player in this has been, this is something that I know folks there are really thinking about, across the board. It's not, you have a special set of relationships, but that process is being echoed elsewhere, throughout the university and indeed throughout the world. So how are you how is that process going? Because that is it's one thing to actually extract the sound in a decent, way from, cylinders that are, upwards of 70 years old. But it's another thing to think about, well, now we have it, what do we do with it?
Right, right. It's one community at a time. It's a long process. It takes time, and you have to put in the work. You have to put in the time. And that's how we're moving forward with it, one community at a time.
Yeah. Do you have, and this is the last I'll ask about this. Do you have, when you say, one community at a time, presumably some of this, because the material was seen to be endangered at the time, and this is something that the Grammy Foundation has dealt with, the Grammy Museum Foundation has dealt with a number of times. That wasn't so bad, 2 seconds. The idea that some recordings may represent the only extant evidence that is known of either an endangered language or dialect, or in many cases a set of vocabularies and syntaxes that have been modified over time and there may not be recourse among the elders of these folks to retrieve it without these kinds of documentations, sonic documentations. So I guess my question is, are you finding that there are usually given folks within a group that are kind of taking the lead, or is this all kind of a democratic process that everybody or a whole series of folks are involved?
It varies really greatly. It does. And so I think just the role that the museum has is that we house the recordings, we have them digitally available. We have a whole media permissions process where representatives from tribes, individuals from tribal communities can reach out to us. We don't charge for this. And so if you're from that tribal community, we do not charge you for your own recording of your own language. And so that is how we work with the communities there.
Yes, great, thank you. This is going to come up again when we get to access, I'm sure. So we'll look forward to picking up this thread. Elizabeth and Rob, challenges, things that, again, dealing with a wide variety of media over a long period of time. Your specialist, Patrick Feaster, is well known in this field. So you had somebody, a good authority to work with. He doesn't seem like a very authoritarian guy, I must say. He's quite, quite humble and easy to get along with. I've met him a few times, so that's my brush with greatness for today. But yeah, so how did you guys encounter the work you were doing? Where were some of the challenges or some of the unexpected bonuses even?
I'll start with kind of saying that our main impetus for this project was that we didn't have any real inventory of what we had. We had 53 boxes of 78s and about a one-page listing that had these boxes had these artists in them, and that was it. And they had even been stored in such a way that in order to access all the records in a box, you had to open the whole box and unwrap them together. So we really, there was a huge push at the beginning to just get every record looked at and every record identified and all of the metadata captured for it. And we actually mobilized our front of house staff so we had, in addition to Rob and myself, we have 3 primarily visitor services staff, and we train them on object handling and how to read records, and now have a spreadsheet with 3,000 lines of information that we didn't have at the start of this project.
Yeesh. Thinking of our, again, our viewers who might not understand this, when you say, reading a recording, let's imagine a 78. I won't do the screen share, but this is I'll start with a description. This is a 10-inch, typically 10-inch in diameter, usually after World War I, and certainly almost totally by the end of the 1920s, with sound recording on both sides of the disc, some sort of label, identification, marking, if it is commercially issued, a label as we come to know it, identifying the piece, the artist, the manufacturer, that is to say, who gets the money, and then perhaps specific things that identify this given recording in relationship to other recordings, some sort of commercial markings and recording markings, if you will. So how did you teach? What were the things you trained your folks to look for?
Well, so it started off with, actually, I think Elizabeth and I doing a little learning ourselves. So Patrick consulted at the beginning of the project, and we learned a little bit about the quirks of early record manufacturing, where so catalog numbers are one thing, but catalog numbers do not always correspond to the same physical recordings, just because of how records were manufactured and how things would wear out over time in a way that's quite different than how it is now. So I learned what take numbers are, which we mentioned briefly earlier. So you could have the same piece and it could be stamped a myriad of different ways on different records. You could also have the same side, the same exact take, same exact side stamped on multiple records with different catalog numbers, depending on who was issuing it. And with percussion in particular, like you mentioned, with the varying audiences, you could kind of see some of this where certain pieces would pop up in sometimes like an E series, which was sort of the ethnographic series, and then occasionally it would pop up on a more commercial side of a different record. So a lot of that was learning to, you're not only looking at the label itself, but you're looking at the physical object. So there are numbers that were stamped into the record itself around near the center of it, or sometimes near off the edge. And so we all learned how to read those. And once we learned that, it was easier to teach. And then, as Elizabeth mentioned, object handling was a matter of, rubber gloves and, how to switch envelopes carefully and how to unpack these things. It really was packed in the most impractical way. It was as if you laid everything out in a row. Like they must have had some mythical 20-foot table and then, folded them almost like a fabric ream or something. So to get at these, they had to open a whole box at the same time. And there was old foam and old bubble wrap that we were contending with. So it was really a matter of, getting everything out and really thoroughly rehousing it and marking down all this information to get the clearest picture as possible.
So
with the rationale being that if you can read it on the disc, put it in the spreadsheet. Like if there's any doubt, write it down.
So what did again, for folks who might want to know how this works, what did rehousing these objects mean for you guys? That these things were presumably, they were 40 in a box or whatever. You carefully picked up got them out of their container. And then what did you do with them once you had, in effect, read them for what their information? What happened to them at that point?
Yeah, rehousing was actually fairly simple, in part because we were working with just one format. We did run into some 78s that were abnormal sizes, but they're all in acid-free record envelopes and they're all in archival boxes. We're in the process of reorganizing them to follow the accession number cataloging scheme we've created. But at the time, we were just putting them back kind of in the same box order that they came in. But in the grand scheme of things, the rehousing portion took a lot of time, but was not actually that complicated to do compared to some of our object-based rehousing where we're building custom boxes and having lots of variables we have to contend with.
Yeah, thank you. Jane, you have, in effect, the opposite set of concerns, as I understand it. You're dealing with unique performances usually captured on magnetic tape, recording tape. Is that correct?
That's correct. They were all recorded on real tape. Yes.
Mm-hmm. So what was the process for you all of not just getting the information? Thank you to the engineers for being on top of that, because as you all might imagine, that's not always the case, and there's all sorts of collections that show up with really, really valuable recordings with not a shred of identifying evidence as to what it is. So what were some of the concerns you had working with a medium that is notorious for different kinds of instabilities?
Well, we were very fortunate because Juilliard's recording engineers had always been meticulous in their maintenance of the reel tapes. And I mentioned the logbooks where they recorded all of the information on the tapes. And at the time that we were preparing to send them off to George Blood for digitization, George Blood was the third-party vendor that we used to do the digitization work. The recording engineers examined each tape, made sure that it was in the appropriate format. So then when they came to us, they had already been checked for any issues, and George Blood did not find any that were not possible to reformat because they were already checked and processed for us. And then the process was very simple in terms of rehousing. When they were returned from George Blood, we put them in acid-free reel tape boxes and sent them off to offsite storage, climate-controlled storage. So it was pretty straightforward for us. I'm curious about the 78 project. Did you find any that were lacking labels?
Yeah, we certainly found a few. Occasionally they would be marked in pencil on the record sleeve if the labels had been missing early enough. But yeah, we've kind of found all variety. We even found some that were test pressings and things like that. So we found all manner of ad hoc labeling and things like that throughout the course of it.
So when confronted with that, what were you, here's a blank, right? What besides the rehousing and making sure that the bubble wrap is not stuck to it, and getting the information off, what did you do anything further at that moment with it, or are these things to be attended to, or did you have other ways of figuring out what the artifact was?
Yeah, I mean, thankfully we didn't have anything that was completely devoid of information. So at least to my recollection, we didn't have anything that was just a blank disc, thankfully. But we would have things where like the record sleeve, it's like the label might be missing, but the record sleeve itself would have something scrawled by probably Gerhardt himself in pencil. And usually at least one side would have a label. So based on reference, a lot of times we would be able to like figure it out via the catalog and things like that to figure out what that side was. And then based on other things, so like even ones that had like white labels and stuff had information on it. And that is really one of the places where Patrick was very helpful. He was really helpful in tracking down things we had questions about and giving us really thorough hypotheses for things that were a little bit out of our wheelhouse in terms of tracking down info on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, when he came for the site visits, there were a list of records that we had prioritized for him taking a closer look at, and was able to track down most of those unknown or missing or questionable records.
Yeah, there's, the danger in all of this, and again, I'm not telling you all anything you don't know, but the danger in this is that some of these things are very, very fragile, and in certain cases, the only way to figure out what the thing is to actually play it, if I can put that in quotes, which means having, knowing that you have the right equipment, knowing that any issues, as Jane said, were already noted or corrected ahead of time. And this, with certain fragile examples, this is, you only get one or two chances to do this kind of thing. It's especially important often with matters related to magnetic tape, but also cylinders, especially, which are more unstable than your average shellac record, which if you essentially house it in a dry area and don't move it terribly much, is pretty stable, more stable than the compact disc that was supposed to solve all these problems for us. I want to get Caroline in on this again, and just as a reminder to everybody, your grant was an assistance grant as opposed to a full preservation grant. So that, in effect, was a more initial take on all of this, no pun intended, an initial approach to this. So again, did you find any specific kinds of preservation issues with the cylinders, or?
Well, this grant specifically was magnetic tapes of field recordings from the 50s, but also magnetic tapes of preserved recordings from the wax cylinders. So we had already done the, in the 50s or so, the preservation of the previous several decades best technologies at the time. So with the magnetic tapes for us, we were dealing with what we call inherent vice, where the materials that the recording equipment and the recording material is made out of have this sort of chemical reaction and destroy itself. There was an urgency for us where we had everything kept in cold storage to slow down that degradation as much as possible. But the urgency was to get it digitized, to get it preserved in the next best technology possible, which for now is digitization. And who knows, 50 years from now, we may need to do this all over again. So I hope the GRAMMY Museum is around then to help us with that. Plugs for money.
Amen.
The urgency was that the material itself was degrading so rapidly, despite our best efforts, that we really needed to move quickly. Otherwise, the recordings would be lost.
This, again, there's it is a, I don't know whether sobering is the right word, but it is a reminder on the sort of the broadest level that so many of these technologies, and here I'm calling out the work of a scholar named Brian Hockman, an American Studies scholar named Brian Hockman, who studied the early histories of emergent media. And one of the things he found was that with photography, with motion pictures, with sound recordings, one of the first uses to which these new technologies were put when they became available in some broader fashion were to the documentation of indigenous peoples and aspects of culture that were seen, and this goes back, to 1880 or 1870, as well as, right on up to the present, of things that were seen to be endangered and imminently disappearing. There's, of course, a pernicious side to all of this with the trope of Native Americans that were supposedly going to, to vanish, but of course have done the exact opposite in most of the cases. And we're at a point today where that whole trope has been questioned. I'm noting this basically just to remind all of us, and again, our viewers, that the utopian aspect of all these technologies is to get us hopeful that somehow we can stop time. Somehow we are capturing moments in the broad flow of experience. And it's true. But accessing those moments over time, and then the care, the upkeep, the diligence needed to make sure that those cylinders aren't going to degrade further. Those tapes aren't going to degrade further, no matter how beautifully well they were made in the beginning, to make sure that those 78s are stored correctly so they don't all just crack. We still haven't, the collectors have done wonders with crazy glue, but it's still not a foolproof system. All of this not just drives the passion with which you all approach your work, but all of it is a reminder that we're still engaged, I think, in a kind of paradox. I don't know. I mean, I guess I have my professor mode on here for a second, so I'm not necessarily telling you all anything you don't know, but I think it's a good reminder, again, that what unites all of these projects is this basic effort, not just in effect to take care of what has been entrusted to you, to take care of different aspects of the past for the present and future. But there's this sort of humane, or very human at any rate, tendency to be thinking about all of this, even if we don't talk about it as if not a race against time, at least an attempt to modify time in a way that keeps us connected to a world that otherwise we seem to be intent on destroying at all times. Okay, philosophy over. Let's talk a little bit about what you've learned, especially as it might, again, noting that everybody has different complications with this, in terms of how you make this material accessible. Just very briefly, you don't have to speak much about it.
I think for us, we'll probably have the briefest answer simply because we were from the sort of assistance grant. So we're not in the phase where we're going to be disseminating this yet. But the cross-referencing with other private collections was part of it, and also realizing, prioritizing what will be useful to disseminate has been a big part of this project. And we've narrowed it down to about over 100 items that we believe have never been digitized before and or are unique to that collection, some of the test pressings and random recordings like that. And then about 400 that have been digitized somewhere, but have generally been digitized in fairly poor condition. So in that sense, your talk about time and things is really interesting, because the funny thing about 78s is they actually have a pretty good idea of what exists. There are catalogs, and Patrick has this, he seemed to have all these resources to basically know every, commercially manufactured disc that should exist. And so in some small way, we get to slaughter ourselves into a project that has been laid out by other people. But yeah, that's our main thing, was the prioritization and getting ready for that dissemination process was really the main aspect of it for us.
Yeah, Jane or Caroline, you want to just talk about that? Yeah.
Sure. Well, we use standard library cataloging systems. So we had already set up a database using library cataloging software called Content DM. It comes from OCLC, and some of your audience down the line would probably know what that is. It's a content management system that's connected to library cataloging conventions. And we had already established that for access to Juilliard performances, ongoing Juilliard performances. But because of copyright concerns, only current students and faculty may access it. It's behind an authentication screen. We wanted to make all of the 1950s audio available. So we had to set up a separate portal into them to do so. And we also checked with some of the copyright holders to make sure it was okay with them. So we felt pretty okay about our ability to do that. But one does have to be very careful about that. And so far we seem to be okay. But anyway, our collection that has been digitized with GRAMMY Museum funds is all open to the public.
That's great. So if you were a member of the public and you were interested in some of this material, what would you do?
Can I share my screen for a minute?
That's a Derek question.
You would go here to this website,
Mhm.
and you can see a description of the project, you can see some images, and you could click on Leontine Price and it would bring you to her recordings.
Great, great. And then, you know, presumably when you go to Juilliard and they would speak with you or one of your colleagues, the reason for their need for access would not have to be like, oh, I'm working on a book on Leontine Price's performances at Juilliard. In other words, there's a broader criterion for access.
Exactly. If you're working on that book on Leontine, then you would be coming to us for access to other information in our archives, and we'd set up an appointment to work with you on those.
Great. Thank you, Jane. Caroline?
Yeah, so I guess the silver lining that was unexpected for us is we have been closed to the public since March. The entire staff of the museum, with some exceptions, we've been working remotely. And so because we did this work in 2018 and in the beginning of 2019, we actually have the capacity to provide access to these digitized recordings a lot more easily. So we have been getting requests throughout this time that we've been closed, and we've been able to very quickly share these digitized files with tribal communities. So it's already happening for us. And then if anyone is interested in accessing recordings in future, our website's hearstmuseum.berkeley.edu. And if you have any trouble finding what you're looking for, you can just reach out to us and we'll help.
Great, great, thank you. Okay, last thing. You guys this has been fabulous. Last question is, do you have any reflections on tips for others about the whole grant process, working with the GRAMMY Museum Foundation, figuring out how to make take the sort of general concerns that you might have about any number of items in your collections, one's collections, whether you're a 2-person shop or a 100-person shop, and make it a specific kind of project, anything at all that you really learned in the process that might help others who will be joining you in the list of alums of the program down the road.
I guess I can say a couple of things. As for small organizations, I think the main thing that really helped us is Elizabeth and I took a lot of time at the beginning of the grant and really hashed out our motivations for applying for it and our long-term goals for utilizing the grant, and took the time to figure out and really assess what we had and the importance in the larger scheme of things. With us being a sort of unattached museum, we're not attached to a university or anything. Having that really fleshed out, I think, gave us the sort of long-term vision to motivate, you know, this sort of gargantuan cataloging process that was the first phase of it.
Mm-hmm.
And so for smaller organizations, that would be my main thing, is to hammer out like the vision of what it is and where it situates itself in your field, as a way to, like, you know, for long-term guiding principles.
And to piggyback off of that, in a larger sense, having organizational goals that your projects fit into. So PAS was really fortunate that we received 3 external grants for collections-based projects in the past year and a half. So we had a lot going on, but we also had the ability to take what we learned from one project and apply it to the other ones. And not ever feeling like we were doing, like having to relearn the same lesson multiple times, and really leveraged what we were doing overall for all of these projects.
I can just add, and I like what you said about fitting into the larger organizational picture. We too were cognizant of that. We had done a lot of preliminary work, including a commissioning of a audio preservation study by an outside company that led to the development of this grant. One thing that I had to be mindful of all along was to read your guidelines carefully. Derek was very helpful in responding to questions, but we wanted to be sure that we were proposing a grant project that would have been suitable for the Grammy Museum Foundation.
Yeah. Turns out reading the label actually matters.
And my comments are very similar for the Hearst Museum. I wasn't actually working at the museum yet, but my colleagues informed me that throughout the whole process, the Grammy Museum Foundation was really responsive and really helpful. The guidelines were really clear and responsive to feedback. Is this an appropriate project that the foundation would fund? So yeah, absolutely recommend.
In my, my little corner of the world, reading grants for decades now, and being on different kinds of committees where, monies are thought about and given out, every institution wants to say yes. That's why they're in business. Most of these processes are not total, just stick it in the mail and wait for an answer 8 months later. Everybody, I think, Derek's been very clear on this, and everybody at the foundation, they want the applications to be as strong as possible, and they encourage, the possible applicants, the potential applicants, to be in touch, with questions about the process or about how to think about that process. It's clear that, for all y'all, I would gather that your customer experience has been satisfactory. You are satisfied with the quality of your care, as Big Hero 6 would put it. I don't mean to put any words in your mouth, but that whole the beginnings of this figuring out what needs you have that help you fulfill the most important aspects of your mission. What the good is to the materials that need to be examined and dealt with, the good to the institution, the good to the various publics you have. All of those things are all in conversation with one another. And it takes a lot of thought. This is even in a place where everything is organized, and mercifully you've got all the equipment, let's say dating back to 1903, that doesn't make the process, instantly transparent. So there's a lot of thinking and labor, as you've all testified, that goes into this. On the other hand, there are so many colleagues and the folks at the foundation that are really interested in helping everybody not just succeed in getting a grant, but helping them figure out what kinds of materials they have, how do those materials fit into the institutional missions. And again, all of us with so much in danger, and with money, even in the flushest of times, money never enough, and in a world where people are asking all sorts of questions about what do we need our resources collectively to go to, it's really important to understand how the work that you all do, the work that we all do, fits in, not just to next month's bottom line and next year's shortfall, or how are we going to get our audiences back, when everybody's been sitting at home, but also, the broadest, the need we all have for connections to the past, the need we all have for music, the needs of the societies that we all live in, the communities we all live in, to take advantage, to partake in the beauty that these collections represent, the beauty that repairs the world. Okay, that's soapbox number 2, but that was short. You guys have been fabulous. I think, Derek, we are more or less at time. Anybody have anything that they just want to add that we somehow neglected?
Enormous thanks to the Grammy Museum Foundation for their support.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. And thank you all for coming and being so eloquent and so inspired by the work you're doing. And obviously it got me inspired too. I hope we can all meet at different moments in real time and real space. And until we'll gather again on the screen, I trust all of you will be well and take care. Thank you so much.